time. She's alive! Alive!
Please give a warm welcome to the hosts of
The Bride of
Alternate Ending.
Hello, ghouls and goblins, and welcome back to Bride of Alternate Ending. I am, as always, one of your hosts, Brennan Klein, and with me, as always, also, it's Tim. Hello.
It is always Tim. Thank you. I was concerned that I had an unstable identity there, but you reaffirmed it for me.
At least
yes,
you always present to me as Tim.
This is the lie that I have been maintaining. So, but hi everybody. We are here to talk about a good movie, a surprisingly good movie actually. But we'll get into that.
And also a good movie that our Patreon crew voted for, which is extra unusual.
I wasn't going to throw the Patreons under the bus, but they have had some very punitive choices for us. But this time around, they did not. We're here to talk about the 1988 remake of The Blob. But I feel like I'm taking your part of the show, Brennan. So how about I hand it back over to you?
I mean, no, that's fine. But yeah, we are doing remakes this month. We presented you with 5 films. The Patreon folks voted for 1988's The Blob, which is the earliest that we chose. I mean, I would say the mid to late 80s is where you're starting to see remakes happen because films have been around for long enough to be remade in such a way. Other than, obviously, they're in older eras, there were frequent readaptations of things, like many Frankenstein stories, many things like that. But remake in the sense that we're approaching it today, I would feel like ramped up with stuff like The Thing and The Fly and The Blob in that era. Do you feel like that's right?
I mean, I think that there's a big old can of worms you just opened, and we wanna close it as soon as we can because it's not talking about The Blob. But there is a very specific thing that happens pretty early on, actually, in film history, which is remakes of silent films once sound comes along, and then remakes of pre-code films after the Hays Code comes into effect. So there's actually a pretty robust culture of remakes that gets into, I'd say, the early 40s. But it does pretty much, to my knowledge at least, dry up after that. You can find examples, and certainly, as you say, you can find examples of readaptations. But no, the idea that we have these things called classic movies, and we are now going to revisit them for modern social tastes, that... In horror, certainly, I think that gets kicked into overdrive by The Fly. I think you've very precisely nailed that.
Well, thank you. But yeah, no, see, yeah, because, there's, like I said, there are remakes for all those different reasons, but I feel like at this point, like, it's when remakes really start to be like, okay, so we have this strong brand recognition, and we have a generation that hasn't seen the movie that they recognize the title for, so we will make them one.
And that's always one of the things that's kind of interested me about, especially early remakes. Are they for people who have not seen the original? Are they for people who have? I think it feels to me like we are in a state right now where they've become this kind of mercenary nostalgia play. So I think to a certain extent they're for people who have seen the original but have not seen it anytime recently. And I don't know if that's true at the point of right now. Like, is The Blob 1988 for people who saw The Blob 1958? And I kind of think the answer to that is no.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it absolutely depends, but I would say, like, especially in the 2000s, I don't think Sorority Row thought that you had seen The House on Sorority Row. But that's a particularly special one because that wasn't.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like your Friday the 13th remake,
Yeah.
your Texas Chainsaw and Texas Chainsaw at the beginning. I'm thinking that kind of thing.
I would say, knowing teenagers' tastes the way that I do, because I unfortunately had to encounter them a lot while working when I did work retail. I think that most horror remakes, teenagers would have seen the remake before the original, except for the like super cool film snob teens.
I find that fact disquieting, and I don't like it.
Oh yeah, no, it is bad and wrong, and I was never like that for the most part, but I do think it's entirely common. Although I do think that remakes get people to watch the originals.
I hope that's the case, and certainly think of how much more of an impact Texas Chainsaw 1974 would have if you were expecting it to be like Texas Chainsaw 2003. In terms of just its like unslickness.
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, let's talk about the Blob. I
Let's
can't
talk
handle
about
thinking
the
about this. Anyway, so yes, we are here to talk about the Blob 1988. It is a remake of the 1958 film of the same name, which was Steve McQueen's second feature as an actor, I believe.
Yep, something like that.
And you've seen the original Blob, but not the remake Blob. That's what we're.
This was my first time seeing the remake Blob. I have seen the original a couple times. Have you seen the original?
Yes,
The Blob.
And I saw it before I saw this one. I've seen every film in the Blob. Well, trilogy is a strong word.
You are one up on me. I have never seen Beware! The Blob.
That is a fine place to be. It is not particularly good, but it was directed by Larry Hagman, who played JR on Dallas. So it's called The Film That JR Shot.
That's good. It's really good.
Anyway, that's the most exciting thing about the movie, so you don't have to see it.
Oh, I'm sure I will at some point.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I've seen worse things than that.
Oh, that is absolutely true. Anyway, so this one is directed by Chuck Russell, fresh off of directing A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, from a screenplay co-written by Frank Darabont, ditto.
Yep. I will say I hadn't really done my research before I watched the movie, but after I watched the movie, I looked up Chuck Russell, and that man's directorial career was a wild ride.
Yeah.
Like, the Nightmare on Elm Street 3, a.k.a. the good sequel to this film, Pipeline, feels very smooth, natural, and indeed maybe even inevitable. Mm-hmm. Where he goes after the Blob, it feels like someone just put a bunch of movie titles in a bag and started pulling them out randomly. Because, like, his very next film, directed after a 6-year gap, is the Jim Carrey vehicle The Mask.
Yeah, which, because I was looking him up to do research for this, and that did kind of shock me.
So he makes the Jim Carrey effects comedy, then he makes, to me at least, the platonic ideal of the sort of forgettable Arnold Schwarzenegger film Eraser.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And it's like, how is that a 4-film filmography? And he goes, to do other things. But, like, how do you make those specific 4 films and then eventually get as far as The Rock is the Scorpion King? Like, how is this all one mind?
Yeah, like...
And then the other...
You can draw, like, a dotted line between these, like, effects-heavy 80s movies and The Mask, maybe, but it's startling.
It is. And also weird to me, his last theatrical feature for a very long number of years, The Scorpion King, was a profitable film, but it also seems to have ended his career, because then it's like 18 years before he makes another movie after that, and I don't get it. So,
I mean, he does seem to take a lot of breaks, James Cameron style.
I mean, truly, I Am Wrath is the Avatar of its day.
That's what I say. It's the Avatar, the Way of Water of its day.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. Truly one of the weirdest director trajectories, although if you'll permit me a quick tangent, again, about House on Sorority Row, because I'm only ever thinking about that movie. The director of that movie, later in his career, went on to shoot a bunch of movies with Hilary Duff, including, like, A Cinderella Story with Chad Michael Murray, and that's probably and Life Size, the movie where Tyra Banks is a Barbie doll that comes to life.
I have never heard of that Tyra Banks film, and I need to see it now.
Oh, yeah.
I think I did encounter that fun fact about A Cinderella Story, I think.
It's really strange, and it's just something I think about all the time. Anyway.
I will say, to your other point, I feel like I have heard you mention the House on Sorority Row on this podcast more than every other time I've ever heard that movie mentioned by anyone.
It's one of my favorite slasher movies.
It's good. Mm-hmm. It's good.
But anyway, we'll talk about that eventually, maybe. But let's talk about the Blob. We'll get through the plot. Really, the plot is the Blob.
There's Blob.
But briefly, there's there's a meteor containing a blob that falls to Earth in the small town of Arborville. It is a ski town that is, well, it's in the middle of autumn. It's economically struggling. There has not been a large snowfall for the past few years. It's not super relevant to the movie, but I thought that was an interesting setting.
It is, and I was reading. Apparently, like, it was some goal of the filmmakers to create the impression in that opening sequence that we were watching like a sort of emptied out town, and we were meant to like think it's some sort of horrible like post Blob apocalypse, only to discover that everyone is at the high school football game, and that is why it appears that the town is empty.
Okay. Did you get that impression watching the movie?
I did not.
No, me neither. Because it did just seem like
it just felt like exposition.
Yeah, just moody credit shots. Because I mean, it does have the signs about like, ski sale, get ready for the season, and that's just what I was reading out of that. But anyway, we are introduced to Paul. He's played by Donovan Leitch, who is also he was in the next year's slasher movie Cutting Class opposite Brad Pitt. He is a football player. He's interested in this girl named Meg, who's played by Shawnee Smith, who would later be in many Saw movies.
6 of the Saw movies, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, as Amanda, Jigsaw's premier acolyte for some time until that anonymous white dude stepped in.
It's
Costas Mandylor?
I was like, he's played by like the most anonymous of all white dudes, and I thank you for reminding me of his name.
The most anonymous white man with the least anonymous name.
Right, and yet. It's like the guy you hire when Gerard Butler has too much charisma.
Yeah, Jesus Christ. Anyway, yeah, so he asks her out. There's also this motorcycle riding bad boy kind of floating around. His name's Brian Flagg. He's played by Kevin Dillon. I'm not dismissing his performance, but is he one of the least convincing bad boys of cinema history?
There are some very unconvincing bad boys in cinema history. I don't know if I could go with one of the most. Certainly, it does feel like the film cast him to streamline the process of making him not a bad boy anymore.
Yeah,
which happens fairly early on.
Yeah, he has this glorious feathered mullet that cascades down his back, and he's basically wearing Seinfeld's puffy shirt the entire time.
He is. He is indeed.
So he's not styled well as a bad boy either. It's just kind of a clusterfuck.
He definitely feels like a European theater kid, like doing the research of playing an American bad boy by just kind of like riding a motorcycle around a small town.
Yes.
Like there's a very weird sort of ersatz quality to it.
Yeah. I could not put it better. But yeah, it's a little peculiar. But, he's doing what he's doing. Actually, I read on the IMDb trivia that according to the trivia, and I'm quoting at the end here, it said that both Shawnee Smith and Kevin Dillon wore hair extensions for the movie at Frank Darabont's insistence.
I'm not sure why Darabont got to insist, because he only wrote the thing, but I buy it.
Yeah, actually, sorry, it might have been Chuck Russell's insistence. But
okay.
At which point I'm like, that's a weird way to phrase it, because he's just the director, so he's just like put hair extensions in. It's not like, you gotta do this for me, I need you to have longer hair.
To be fair, if your hair extensions make you look like Kevin Dillon looks in this movie, I feel like it would go beyond the director suggesting it, and the director would need to pull rank to make me commit to it.
You're probably right. Anyway, it's a wild look, and clearly Chuck Russell had a vision for some sort of...
It is one of the most mullets of any 80s mullet that I have seen.
Yeah, and we're coming just like a year after Kiefer Sutherland and the Lost Boys here. Like this is just a truly shocking mullet.
It is the dark side of mullet to the good side of mullet that Kiefer Sutherland is rocking in that movie, I'd say.
Absolutely. But yeah, so meteor crash, meteor have blob eat people.
Yes. Blob starts by eating a homeless man that Kevin encountered. Kevin Dillon, whose character name is not Kevin.
Brian Flagg.
What is his character name? Brian Flagg. Brian encounters. Clearly now know how I was taking my notes. So Brian encounters homeless man. Homeless man has Blob on his hand. Everyone's freaking out. The kids are freaking out on their way to their date. The other two characters, Paul and Meg, hit the homeless man with their car, and so the three of them take him to an emergency room where he dies pretty quickly.
Oh yeah.
And it's very gross. And I loved that it was very gross.
Oh, there are plenty of very gross things that are about to happen.
This is a very gross movie, and I approved of it. But then, and so we're at this point, what, about 20 minutes into the movie?
Yeah, we're about 20 minutes in,
20.
and we're
because it's done a pretty good job of setting the small town Americana scene.
Yeah, and we're creeping up on the first major like plot spoiler kind of thing. And should we flag it and just talk about it?
We should flag it and talk about it. It happens too early in the movie to skip it, but like, it is very obviously a fake out that sort of worked for me. I think the fake out caught me at least a bit unawares. But we do get a pretty dramatic swerve in the movie's fortunes when the Blob chooses as its second victim, or doesn't choose, but just sort of settles upon Paul, who dies
horribly.
Horribly.
There is a really shocking and viscerally compelling part of his kill, because you see his face kind of pressed against the gelatinous pink kind of screen of the Blob encasing his entire body, but as it dissolves his skull, his jaw like melts open into a wordless scream. It is beautiful.
It is so good. It is so good. And there's like this sort of amniotic feeling about the whole thing to me. And then the scene is given this perfect little like little mint on your pillow afterwards of his arm dissolves off of the rest of his body and falls to the ground, and the fingers are still twitching.
Oh yeah, and it's got and partially because the film, I would be extremely hesitant to call it a horror comedy, but it is a playful horror movie, in that like she's holding on to his hand and is kind of the catalyst for it being ripped away from his body.
Yes. No, I struggled with the adjective to use when I was describing this film on Letterboxd. I think I landed on sardonic, because it is not funny.
No.
But it is also... playful is as good a word for it as any, I think. Like, there's just a sort of, like, giddiness. Even as we've just watched something insanely horrible and traumatizing, the movie doesn't feel like the mode it wants us to feel is like, oh my god, I feel sick and horrified and disturbed. It's kittenish.
Yeah, it's this extremely dark comic vibe, but it has enough control over tone that, you know, it's not grim, even though basically everything on paper in this movie is incredibly grim, and pointedly nasty.
It is a very sort of bleak and as you say, we are not done with horrible gore and death scenes. People die in some very vividly on-screen ways. So it should feel, I think, like there is... It should feel heavy, and it never ever does. And that's actually one of the things that really, really impressed me about the film, is how well it is maintaining a very complicated tone. Like, it almost feels to me... I don't even know how to phrase it necessarily, but like, this film feels like it should not work tonally, and it works so well that it's almost kind of weird to talk about it like it shouldn't work, because like there's never a moment where it feels like it might lose that control. It's just good.
Yeah,
at that tone.
It feels effortless. But yeah, this is a movie that contains both the grotesque on-screen murder of a tween boy, and a weird retelling of the joke about the guy who buys condoms, and then the father of his date is the drugstore clerk.
That scene worked for me to a degree that I am embarrassed to admit.
And it's so...
And to be clear, the condom joke happens before the tween boy dies, so it's not like we're trying to pivot from one to the other.
Yeah. I guess the order of operations is important, but the film, both of those things exist in this same movie, which is still wild.
Absolutely. No, and the condom moment is great because, like, they underplay it all. Like, they both overplay it and underplay it. Like, the character reactions are sort of really leaned on, but then the punchline is just the word ribbed, and it's actually really funny.
It is really funny, and it's also, that's the most overtly and over-the-top comic moment, because the dad's face is hidden behind a newspaper when he goes to meet him, and then he folds it down, and that's when the moment happens.
Yeah.
But it's just, I don't know, so much of this movie is so fun. But also then you have this potential coupling set up. There's a diner waitress played by Candy Clark, and the sheriff played by Jeffrey DeMunn of everything. And they have this, like, potential romance. They have a date planned that then gets interrupted by him having to deal with some Blob-related issues. But not only do both of them die horribly, she dies horribly while witnessing him dissolving inside the body of the Blob. And it's just... and like, it's the type of thing that you can talk about with this kind of giddy fascination, and I don't know how they did it.
I don't know how they did it either, and it's part of the reason I wanted to, like, really land on, boy, that Chuck Russell sure had a weird career. It's weird to me, although as we're talking about it, it becomes more and more clear to me how he ended up on The Mask, because there is a sort of puckish humor that's in this movie. But how did it take this man 6 years to make his next film? The Blob was a hit. He was really good at directing it.
Was it?
Wasn't it?
I'm not sure the 88 Blob landed theatrically super well, or at least it had, like, I think it had a lukewarm kind of box office. But yeah, we'll double check on that.
That is a researchable question.
Exactly. It hit very well for me when I saw it in 2013 for the first time.
And you know, this is as good a point as any to mention. I somehow, it did not turn a profit.
Oh,
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was...
And it cost probably more than it should have. I mean, the money clearly was spent wisely, but, like, if you were making a remake of The Blob, I think you probably try to spend less than they spent on this movie. They spent $10 million on this movie.
Yeah, they probably... I mean, we'll talk about it, but there's, like, a whole kind of third act kaiju moment that doesn't really need to be as big as it is.
In general, I think the film is very specifically copying the cadences of the first film, and maybe would have benefited from not, because it ends up recreating the film's third act in a lot of ways, and the third act is already my least favorite part of the original film.
But yeah, we'll get there when we're more into deeper spoiler territory.
But I did want to that's not where I was heading. I had somehow picked up the idea that this is a film with a poor reputation. That people think this is not a good horror film. And I have not merely been disabused of that in my own heart. I don't really know where I got that impression, because that doesn't seem to be true.
Yeah, people... I mean, at least the horror people that I've met tend to really like it. Although, I would say it certainly doesn't enter the conversation of 80s remakes as much as The Thing or The Fly do, so that might be where you got that impression.
It could be, and it has a low IMDb score. Like, it's 6.6, which feels to me like it should be higher than 6.6. But when I was watching it, or before I started watching it, I mentioned to a friend of mine who is versed. He's not like a horror guy, but he's seen more than his share of horror. I mentioned that I was watching this film. He did not know what I was talking about.
Oh.
He was unaware there was a remake of The Blob. He'd seen the original. He knew the original film. Which did come as a surprise to me, because certainly I've known about this film for a lot of years. But it does feel like its profile is oddly low.
Which is such a shame. And it clearly, it was not as... Wait, so it cost $10 million and didn't even make $10 million. Yeah, so that's just kind of a bummer. So it must have just kind of been depressed and just kind of lurking for several decades under the surface.
Something like that. I could not begin to tell you, based on my incredibly cursory Wikipedia search, when it found its cult and when it started reconstructing its reputation. My guess would be fairly early on. This feels like a film that would have done very well on home video.
Yeah, I'm certain that must have been the case. Because I certainly know people in the horror sphere who are nostalgic for the Blob, like from at least relatively that time period.
Okay, yeah, no, it definitely... I mean, because it's selling itself very well to the horror audience, and we've already talked about the gore, but I think it's worth kind of living with that, because this movie has bet a lot on its effects work, and the effects work lives up to it, and not only the gore effects, I wouldn't say. Obviously the Blob itself is a visual effect. That's kind of the whole point of it. That was the whole point of it in 1958. And I'd say, to a certain extent, we could accuse the 1988 film of not having a unified vision for what the Blob is as a visual object. And apparently there was also like some slight concern on the effects team themselves that they didn't feel like they quite had like a target they were aiming for all the time. So sometimes the Blob seems to have like kind of bluish pink like tissue and appendages, and sometimes it appears to be more like just kind of bubbly like rose colored foam. So it's not always exactly the same look, but it is certainly carried off very well, I would say.
Yeah,
in almost all of its appearances.
It's not necessarily consistent, but in a way that does feel appropriately alien and inexplicable, where it's like sometimes it has tentacles and they're these kind of like veiny, meaty, like strong appendages, and sometimes it is literally just a blob just kind of rolling around.
Yeah.
But any individual shot, it looks good.
Yeah, the conception was apparently an inside-out stomach. So like the stomach acid is sort of on its surface, and it like absorbs you into the stomach acid, and I do think the best parts of it do have that kind of like that organ meat feeling. Like you can, it doesn't just feel like amorphous the way that the 1958 version does. It actually does feel like we're seeing like muscle and tissue kind of stretching and flexing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, when it is in motion, it's not like, oh, here's a ball of KY jelly kind of rolling around. Like it does feel like it's gripping onto the surface of things in this really disgusting way.
It is an extraordinarily gross thing, and I love that. And that gets me back to the point I was making, which is this film did, I think, what it needed to do to appeal to the audience it's trying to appeal to. I think it has great gore effects, and I think it has great blob effects. I think it does not fuck around in getting us to the good stuff. Like it sets the scene, and it sets the scene well, and I think that I have a good sense of who the three main teens are. But it is getting us to that hospital sequence with all due speed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's doing one of the things that this type of movie, when done well, is very effective, which is that it's painting characters in these really broad kind of archetypical brushstrokes, but still making them human enough that we care about them when they start to die.
Right, exactly. So it is a little odd to me that the movie couldn't find an audience, because it feels like it's really doing all the things that I would want it to do for me as an audience member.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe... I mean, I couldn't begin to guess. I'm no like expert on the public opinion on things in the late 80s, but I don't know, maybe the 50s were just too passé and people thought it was just a silly thing to do at that point. I don't know. I love the Blob so much, and I love the '50s Blob. If I was around in the time, I would be like a pig in shit. I'd be very happy with myself.
But yeah, no. So a good movie, a movie that certainly amply overperformed my expectations, and I was very, very pleased by that.
I'm so thrilled about that because I realized shortly before you watched it that this was going to be a first time watch for you, and I was hoping it would land.
It landed very, very well. So no worries about that. I definitely had a great time, and we'll be proselytizing the Blob going forward for the reasons we've touched on and more. I do want to sort of return, if we could, to those characters, because one of the things that really took me aback was, so as you say, they are archetypes. We have like sort of the football hero, and we have the like all-American girl, and we have the bad boy biker. So we have these very like stock 50s even style character types, but they do feel distinct, and they have personalities, and we already sort of mentioned, Kevin Dillon as a biker bad boy. He's not the baddest by any means, but I almost feel like that works to the film's advantage because he ends up feeling much more textured, I think, than the stock character. And I would say that's true of the other two as well. I mean, like, Paul's thing, and we, touched on the condom scene, we have like the good square-jawed, white-bread all-American hero, but he's planning on having sex. And that's a little thing, but like the hero doesn't have sex in a 50s movie.
I would maybe like muddy the waters on that a little bit, because like his friend is buying the condoms for himself and pretend that it's for him. So I think he is more virginal than that, because it does seem like he's like the good one.
Okay, that's fair. That is muddying the waters.
Yeah. Meanwhile, his friend is fully a date rapist and gets what he deserves.
That's true.
Although he has an incredibly well-stocked bar in the trunk of his car, which was fascinating to watch.
That is the one scene for me that might have gone a little bit further into comedy than I was prepared for or wanted.
Yeah, no, that character could have been cut almost more or less entirely, and I would have been totally happy with myself. But yeah, so I don't know about the Paul character, but I totally agree about Kevin Dillon's character, and he's presented as very much as the misunderstood guy with the heart of gold. Like, he works at this mechanic shop, and he has this nice rapport with the guy who works there.
Yeah, but what I sort of wanted to get at, because I do think this is going on with the characters, I was not ready for the acting to be as good as it was. To be very, very frank, Kevin Dillon is not to me a name that inspires much confidence, nor frankly is Shawnee Smith, and I rather liked both of them. Yeah,
they're perfectly like they're delivering solid performances to get across, because this movie is not necessarily interested in them in the second half, but they are doing enough to keep you invested in their plight.
It is the kind of film that I think has done the work in the first half of establishing the characters and their relationships and their stakes and making us root for them, so that it does not have to worry about doing that work in the second half. I found that to be a very... I did not forget about them. I did not lose interest in them. I did not, like... They did not feel they had been subsumed as protagonists. They just weren't on screen all the time.
Yeah,
and I was fine with that.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And also, one thing I loved. Okay, very, very spoiler alert. I'm actually going to talk about the final shot. So I'm marking my territory here. No, if you want to see the movie, just go watch it and come back. I'm very, very pleased that this movie ends on a hug and not a kiss between the two of them.
I agree with that, although I am less pleased that it ends with both of them alive.
Yeah, that's the one place where the movie pulls any sort of punch. It's that, Meg, her entire family, and her new love interest, her companion all survived this movie.
Yeah, it is the I don't want to move too far away from your thoughts, so we can wrap that up if you want to continue living on that.
Yeah, sure.
Before
Just
we talk about the ending as a whole.
Yeah, just real quick. Yeah, because they are not subsumed by the third act, but the third act doesn't build a lot more onto their characters, and I think a romantic arc would not have been earned between them. And also, I'm just sick of that trope in general of like one horrible night, and the death of a different boyfriend would make you fall in love. Just seems like a ridiculous thing.
No, it does. I mean, to a certain extent, I buy it because they're teenagers, and teenagers are both creatures of the present and also hormonal. So, like, I never entirely don't buy that. But I do think that you're correct that the film does not do the legwork to make it happen, and I agree that it's good that it's not really trying to sell us on that at the end. But yeah, this is one of the points where I didn't love that the 1950s film ends, without the world having been destroyed by the blob. But to a certain extent, I buy it because it's the 50s. It's really, really tough to sell that kind of nihilistic ending. For the 80s film, I really was holding out hope that it was going to go a bit further in the direction of the blob is an unstoppable force of devouring hunger, and it still ends up not inconveniencing anything larger than this individual town.
That's true. There is that silly little button on the end that, well, I guess what I was talking about, but wasn't the final shot because it ends on what would.
Oh, that's right. It has the coda.
Yeah, what would now be a post-credit sequence about the preacher that has little blob thing living in a jar.
Preacher has little blob thing, which I mean, I'm as big a fan of the end question mark as anybody, but I do feel like this film could have had more meanness in its soul in that third act, and again they're directly copying the original. I mean, it's actually a very faithful remake in a lot of ways, not necessarily in terms of specifically who the characters are, specifically what they do, but the rhythm of the film is very much a direct remake. So I appreciate that. At the same time, I would have liked it, as you say, the film pulls its punches a little bit, and I wish it had pulled them less, shall we say.
Yeah, no, I hear that, but I around this time, like, I mean, in 86 we would have had Little Shop cutting that same type of ending because the audiences were not wanting it to happen. So I feel like maybe that was kind of the vibe that was going around.
I guess. I mean, certainly if it had come out 10 years earlier, same year as like the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it probably would have been easier to sell audiences on a sort of completely apocalyptic vision. So maybe that's part of it. And I mean, certainly I am actually a booster of the theatrical ending of Little Shop, so it's not like I just want all of my movies to end with mass death. But in this case, I don't know. It felt like they were laying the grounds for it in a way that they didn't. They could have embraced it in a darker way than they did.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree, and you know, as unusually well shaded as these characters are, I wouldn't have minded if they were devoured by the blob at the end. So it would totally be fine.
They're well shaded enough that I can follow them as protagonists, but not so well shaded that their deaths would have traumatized me.
Yeah, so that could have been cool. I think it was probably more of a budgetary concern than anything.
Could be.
But yeah, so the third act is where we get this kind of military quarantine of the town, and it's kind of revealed that the blob is probably a result of these military experiments with biological weaponry. How do you feel about this kind of dramatic change in the third act into more of an adventure film kind of thing?
Didn't love it.
Yeah.
Didn't love it. I think the first hour is so good. It is so impeccably paced. It is full of all these really great horror, gory set pieces. Again, we've talked about the characters, we've talked about the comedy. I do think the shift into government paranoia is a solid one on paper. I don't think it plays.
Yeah.
I think that there's just too much plot and too few scenes of the Blob eating people in that last 30 minutes.
Yeah, I think the movie realized it needed to have more of a hook for the third act, because it's like the second act is very much just intercut scenes of the Blob murdering people, which is fine with me.
It works. It's good.
But they were like, okay, we got to throw in something else to get this another half hour. And yeah, a lot of that doesn't work. I will say a lot of the stuff involving the main characters just fighting against the Blob still works. Like, there's a really, really cool sequence in the sewer where Shawnee Smith is trying to climb out of this big wide storm drain, and it's too slippery, and she's like kind of sliding back toward the Blob.
No, that was good. That was a good scene. And I do like, I was very thrown. We get a with as credit, which, if you're not familiar with the conventions of how credits work, you generally give your and as or with as to a name that you want to be like, oh yeah, we got this person.
Yeah, it's like with Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis.
Exactly. We get a with Joe Seneca as Dr. Meadows.
Huh.
And is Joe Seneca someone I'm supposed to know? Because I don't.
Okay, good, because the name sounded vaguely familiar to me, but I was like, I don't know.
And I will say this about Joe Seneca. I thought he was good. He sort of ends up being the kind of main embodiment both of the government's attempt to contain the Blob, but also potentially the government's shenanigans in having the Blob be a problem in the first place. So it's a good role, a sort of ambivalently villainous, maybe not. I thought he was good with it. He managed to have that sort of both an authoritative presence in that he felt like, okay, good, the grown-ups are here, but also an authoritative presence in that it felt like he could at any moment decide that the correct solution was to burn the town to the ground, including the humans still in it. So I thought he was a good presence within a character that I regretted the movie deciding that it needed.
Yeah. No, absolutely. He is delivering a performance that does feel like a with and performance, which is like, it's a little more like, you can tell this person is a little bit slumming it, and they know it, and it's a little bit arch, but it also has the gravitas of someone who's worked for a long time.
No, it for sure does. I'm actually going to pull up his career right now and just sort of see what do we know Joe Seneca.
Yeah.
But continue.
But yeah, like, this is a role that I could see being played now by a Jeffrey Wright or an Angela Bassett, where
yes,
it's like they're very, very good, and it's just 1% over the top, but like in a good way, and in a way that lets you know that they think they're a little bit better than the material that they're in.
For sure. And I'm not seeing in his filmography where that comes from. He's kind of a TV guy.
Yeah, I imagine. Was he on a show for 6 years or something?
He wasn't. He was a guest star.
What the hell? Who is this guy?
I just don't even know. He's police sergeant in Taking of Pelham 123.
Does he just have a super good agent?
He's party goer in Kramer versus Kramer. He must just have a hell of an agent. No, I mean, I thought he was a solid actor. I will say two things. Both, you know how the IMDb does the, like, here's the 4 films for which this person is best known? It is telling me that the film for which he is best known is, in fact, The Blob, which is reasonable. But it's also implicitly, in that case, telling me that The Blob is a film that is more popular and better known than Spike Lee's Malcolm X, which he also appeared in after this. And that feels like I don't want the IMDb to be doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that system basically determines who is is determined by who is clicking on that actor from what landing pages. So I think the idea is that more people saw him in The Blob and were like, who the fuck is this guy? As opposed to watching Malcolm X, where there are many other more important people.
That is a comforting realization. I thought it was just the raw popularity of the movie, so thank you for clarifying
I'm pretty sure that's what it is, and we can only hope.
That would also explain why Silverado is skewed higher than Malcolm X by the IMDb's algorithm.
Yeah, I think that must be it.
Good to know. But no, I thought he was good in it. I feel like I'm sure less so in 1988 than it would have felt even a few years later. The card of, oh, it was all the government all along. They had some nasty stuff. That's, to me, in this particular narrative, like I can be all about the government has a bioweapon gone wrong. I like it being some sort of just wholly inexplicable alien a lot more than I like that implication.
Yeah, it does undercut it a little bit. Because, yeah, and that's the thing that is most 50s about it, is this thing crash lands on Earth and it fucks us up and we don't know what to do about it.
Yep, exactly. Because in the 50s it would have been... Basically, in the 50s it would have been a metaphor for, communism. And in the 80s it's a metaphor for...
the Cold War, usually.
I mean, who's to say?
AIDS.
It's clearly post Watergate. It feels like this is an anti-Reagan film more so than a pro-Reagan film.
It's certainly
not that Reagan's in it, but like it doesn't trust the government.
No, certainly not. And the economy is not trickling down to Arborville.
It is not. It is not at all.
So in that degree, yeah, it's just a little bit of distrust of the government in a way that a lot of Reagan era films weren't necessarily. Horror films more often were critical of the economic policies, but it's a little outspoken.
Yeah. No, it's true. It feels like that's much more of a it's kind of anticipating in a way, because again, if you play this in the 90s, post the X-Files, this feels like a very obvious thing for the movie to do. It's not an obvious thing for it to do in 1988. So I guess that makes me feel slightly better about it, but I would still rather the Blob just be wholly beyond explanation.
Oh, absolutely.
And I do think the movie lets it be at least somewhat ambiguous.
Yeah, it's not over-explaining. It's not, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho sitting you down and explaining every single thing that's going on with the Blob at the end.
Exactly.
And that's, that it is what it is sometimes. It's not horrible and film breaking. It's just a down step in the third act.
I would agree. And if the third act was the movie, I would still be kindly disposed towards the Blob. I just was really, really, really digging the first hour. I ended up giving this movie 4 stars, and I'm comfortable with that, but I could easily see it going down to 3.5 stars when I'm not so taken with the newness of it, because that third act is a downshift. It is an unambiguous downshift. And
full disclosure, I did go down a half star on this rewatch. I originally had it at 4.5 stars, and I have it at 4 now.
Okay.
A movie does not have to have rewatch value. That's not an inherent necessity for a movie to be good. But it did dip a little bit on rewatch, because the plot part is it'll get you through the movie, but it's not really enough to revisit. And if you already know what happens, the parts that are in between the Blob parts, you're like, all right, let's pick this up a little bit.
And I mean, I think that it sounds like I weight rewatchability higher than you, potentially, because to me that is a pretty... If a movie's second time through is just not as much fun, that speaks to me of the movie having some structural issues.
Yeah, no, it's still a deeply fun movie, but there were maybe 5 to 10 individual minutes in the movie where I was like, okay, but it wasn't
And I anticipate it's going to rewatch well. I look forward to showing this movie to people. But I do think I'm going to have mentally sort of written out the third act by the time I start really trying to sell people on it very hard.
One thing that did boost me on this rewatch, because I haven't seen it since 2013 or whatever when I first watched it.
Sure.
But in between then and now, I started my marathon of Beverly Hills 90210, and there is a character in Season 1 and the first half of Season 2 played by Douglas Emerson, who plays the shitty little bratty kid with the Walkman who gets iced by the Blob.
Okay.
And he is a uniquely bad child actor. And in a way, and I mean unique in that I don't think anyone else can do what he's doing, which is that every syllable he speaks, he moves his eyebrows. So like he waggles his face in this way that is deeply disturbing. And I cannot recreate it. It is almost impossible. It must take a Herculean effort for him to do this.
Oh wow.
But he also dies horribly in 90210. Actually, he's showing his friend Brian Austin Green his dad's gun collection, and he accidentally shoots himself in the gut at his own birthday party.
That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. Because when you were leading up to he shoots himself, I was like, oh well, that's not even close to being this bad. But gut shots are not a good way to go.
No. But yeah, no. It was fascinating to watch him a couple years younger, like being a legit kid and not a high school student, and still just delivering the same kind of performance.
That's amazing. I like the idea of the 90210 casting director like seeing this exact movie and being like, "That's the one. That's the kid who can do the eyebrow trick we've been talking about."
Yeah, it was, like I said, maybe it's a skill. Like I can't do it, so I shouldn't begrudge him of that being his acting trick.
Every actor has to find their slot in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and his slot was exiting 90210 and joining the army and never looking back.
Sometimes that is also what you need to do to survive in the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm very good at tangents, but is there anything else you want to bring up about the Blob?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I think its strengths are sort of what we identified at first. Like, all the spoilery stuff is more sort of its weaknesses, but like the tone, I just want to really return to that. This film's control of tone is as good as any horror film in the 80s. Like, I don't get how it's as good at balancing really visceral horror with a kind of overall tone of merriment, but it is.
Yeah, and I mean it's coming from Chuck Russell, who also ushered Funny Freddy to the screen in the one film where he's not super grating.
That's the thing. In the only film where Funny Freddy is still a plausible threat. Yeah,
so this is it just seems to be something he knows how to
do. Maybe it does make sense they tap him for the mask. I don't know. Now, the more we're talking about it, the more like, yeah, this is a guy who can actually make comedy feel grounded in something other than just Jim Carrey being a rubber-faced asshole.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen The Mask since I was like 5, so I can't speak to its control of tone, but maybe.
I will certainly say I did not like it in the same way that I basically don't like any pre-The Cable Guy Jim Carrey movie.
I mean, that just makes sense.
Yeah, he was a big deal at the time. I found him very shrill.
Yeah, that's kind of his thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I might revisit The Mask at some point. Not anytime soon, but if I do, I'll let everyone know.
I kind of feel like I might have to do a complete filmography binge of Chuck Russell at this point.
Have you seen Eraser?
I have seen Eraser. That's why I was calling it the platonic ideal of a forgettable Arnold Schwarzenegger film. It is. I was describing it just yesterday in this context. In fact, it is the exact Arnold Schwarzenegger film that is not good enough to have moments that are individually memorable because you liked them, while not being bad enough to have individual moments that are memorable because of how garish they are. It is just like the perfect mediocre Schwarzenegger film.
Okay, yeah, I mean that makes sense. Is that the one where he like has to fist fight James Caan in the end, and they have to make him seem like a credible?
I don't remember because the movie has occupied no space in my brain other than sort of just like a vague porridgey mush.
Fair enough.
I'm pretty sure it's the scene where he kills alligators and makes a joke about luggage.
Oh, okay. I've heard of that. Great.
It's because he quips. And I think even that being the Schwarzenegger quip speaks to the quality of the quipping in Eraser.
I would think so.
So whatever Chuck Russell had that was allowing him to balance comedy and not comedy through that point seems to have abandoned him in 1996.
Yeah, or perhaps the Blob underperformed. He hadn't directed for 6 years. He was probably like, I'm just gonna do some work for hire and make some fucking money.
Right.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah, but in work for hire, you can still do better than a racer. But no, I get it. You get to take the jobs that you take,
And
those first two are really good.
yeah, and that's not nothing.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think we'll put a nice little bow on the Blob. Next time in 2 weeks, we are going to be discussing a very intriguing remake that neither of us have seen, which is 1990's Night of the Living Dead, which was directed by frequent George Romero collaborator Tom Savini. That's going to be something.
It is a film that I have not ever gone so far as to say that I have not been avoiding it, but I have certainly been doing none of the work that would be required to see it.
Mm-hmm. And well, doesn't it stars Tony Todd, right, as that lead character?
I think that is the case.
It's got to be something, right? We'll see. We'll find out.
And we'll see. We'll find out.
Anyway, that's what we're doing next time to close out Remake Month. But until then, you can find more of my reviews and Tim's and podcasts and everything else over on alternateending.com. And you can follow me on Twitter if you want, at It's Raining Brens, and follow Alternate Ending at all the places they are.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter if you want. You shouldn't. You can follow me on Letterboxd, though.
Yeah, do that. Follow Tim on Letterboxd. Follow me on Letterboxd. You can find all that shit in the show notes, as well as how to follow Alternate Ending on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all those fun places. We also have merch. Check out the Alternate Ending merch. All
right.
Yeah, great.
We got merch.
I need to develop a script for Brad. I don't. I borrow Rob's for when I do the main show, but Brad, I'm like, whatever.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you so much for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.